desert fortresses, Richard the Lionheart, Saladin, and enough crossed wires to keep historians employed for the next 900 years. These were the Crusades, a series of religiously authorized wars beginning in 1095, most famously fought between Latin Christian armies from Western Europe and Muslim powers in the Eastern Mediterranean. But they were not one continuous war. They were not fought by two perfectly united sides, and they definitely cannot be explained as simply Christians versus Muslims. Welcome to 2 centuries of faith ambition, diplomacy, trade, betrayal, and medieval logistics, humanity's natural enemy. Jerusalem was sacred to Christians, Muslims, and Jews, and by 1095, it had been under Muslim rule for more than 4 centuries. Christian pilgrims still traveled there, although conditions changed depending on the ruler, the route, and the political situation. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern, Greek-speaking continuation of the Roman Empire, had lost much of Anatolia to Seljuk Turkish forces. Emperor Alexios I therefore asked Western Christians for military assistance. He was probably imagining a manageable force of trained soldiers. What he eventually received was the medieval equivalent of clicking, "Invite all contacts." In November 1095, Pope Urban II preached at the Council of Clermont in France. He called on Western Christians to assist Eastern Christians and undertake an armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Participants took a religious vow, wore a cross on their clothing, and were offered remission of the temporal penalties associated with confessed sins. Religion was central to crusading motivation, but individuals could also be influenced by family duty, honor, politics, adventure, or hopes of advancement. And contrary to the idea that crusading was free real estate with swords, the journey was ruinously expensive. Many participants sold or mortgaged property just to leave home. Before the main armies were properly assembled, loosely organized groups set out in 1096. The best-known movement was associated with the preacher Peter the Hermit. These travelers were poorly supplied and badly disciplined. Some groups attacked Jewish communities in Rhineland cities, including Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, murdering residents or forcing conversions. These massacres were not an accidental side note. They became one of the Crusades' earliest and most devastating legacies. The remaining People's Crusade reached Byzantine territory, ignored advice, crossed into Anatolia, and was almost completely destroyed by Seljuk forces. The official expedition had not even begun, and everything was already going terribly. The principal armies departed later in 1096, under nobles including Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and Baldwin of Boulogne. They crossed into Anatolia, helped capture Nicaea, and survived a brutal march through extreme heat and chronic food shortages. Antioch fell in 1098 after a long siege, betrayal from inside the city, and a second siege, in which the Crusaders became the ones trapped. Somehow, they escaped and continued south. In June 1099, a greatly reduced army reached Jerusalem. After a 5-week siege, the Crusaders broke into the city on 15 July. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were massacred, although medieval accounts exaggerate some details. The result, however, was unquestionably mass killing. The First Crusade had achieved its objective at a horrifying human cost. The conquest produced 4 Latin Christian states, collectively called Outremer, the County of Edessa, Principality of Antioch, County of Tripoli, and Kingdom of Jerusalem. Their rulers controlled important cities and stretches of coastline, but they remained surrounded by larger Muslim powers and contained populations of Muslims, Jews, and several Eastern Christian communities. Castles, fortified ports, and military orders became essential. The Knights Templar combined monastic vows with warfare, while the Hospitallers developed from an organization caring for pilgrims and the sick. Yet the region was not permanently locked in battle. Trade continued, local alliances crossed religious boundaries, and ordinary people often interacted while rulers prepared their next argument. In 1144, the Muslim ruler Zengi captured Edessa, the first Crusader state to fall. Europe responded with the Second Crusade, led by King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany. Their armies suffered major losses crossing Anatolia, then joined forces in the Levant and attacked Damascus. The siege collapsed after only a few days, partly because of poor coordination and confused strategy. The crusade ended in humiliation. Meanwhile, Zengi's son Nur al-Din strengthened Muslim power in Syria and promoted the idea of uniting the region against the Crusader states. The political pieces were moving toward one particularly famous opponent. That opponent was Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known in the West as Saladin. Originally serving Nur al-Din's dynasty, Saladin became ruler of Egypt and gradually united Egypt and much of Syria. In July 1187, he trapped the main army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem near the Horns of Hattin. Exhausted by heat, thirst, and smoke, the Crusader army was destroyed. Jerusalem surrendered to Saladin that October. Europe launched the Third Crusade, featuring 3 celebrity monarchs: Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England. Frederick drowned while crossing a river in Anatolia. Philip helped capture Acre, then returned home. Richard remained, winning a major battle at Arsuf but never taking Jerusalem. In 1192, Richard and Saladin agreed to a truce. The Crusaders retained parts of the coast, Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, and Christian pilgrims could visit the city. After years of warfare, the ending was essentially a negotiated access agreement. Pope Innocent III called another crusade, with Egypt intended as the strategic target. The Crusaders contracted Venice to build and operate a massive fleet, but too few troops arrived, meaning they could not pay the agreed price. Venice offered a solution: help capture the Christian city of Zara. From there, the expedition became involved in a Byzantine succession dispute, after a claimant promised money and military support in exchange for being placed on the throne. The promises could not be fulfilled, relations collapsed, and in 1204 the Crusaders captured and brutally sacked Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world. They never reached Egypt or Jerusalem. The crusade launched to defend Christianity had instead devastated a Christian empire. Medieval planning had officially achieved self-parody. By the 13th century, crusading was no longer limited to expeditions toward Jerusalem. Popes granted crusading privileges to campaigns against Muslim powers in Iberia, non-Christian peoples around the Baltic, and Christian groups condemned as heretics. The Albigensian Crusade in southern France, for example, targeted the Cathars and devastated communities throughout the region. Then came the so-called Children's Crusade of 1212. Despite the name, it was not an officially authorized crusade, and probably included poor adults and adolescents as well as children. Separate popular movements set out from France and Germany, convinced that faith would succeed where armies had failed. Neither reached Jerusalem, and later stories about every participant being sold into slavery are difficult to verify. Crusading enthusiasm had escaped the control of crusading organizers. The Fifth Crusade targeted Egypt, hoping that capturing its economic heart would force the return of Jerusalem. The Crusaders seized Damietta in 1219, rejected favorable negotiations, and advanced toward Cairo, just as the Nile flooded. Trapped by water and Egyptian forces, they surrendered Damietta in 1221. The Sixth Crusade was stranger. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II negotiated with Sultan al-Kamil and gained control of Jerusalem in 1229 without a major battle. Jerusalem returned to Muslim control in 1244. King Louis IX of France then attacked Egypt during the Seventh Crusade. Damietta was captured again, the army became trapped again, and in 1250 Louis was captured and ransomed. Apparently nobody had updated the Egypt campaign manual. Louis tried once more in 1270, this time landing in Tunisia, where disease struck the camp and killed him. A smaller expedition led by England's Prince Edward reached Acre in 1271, but could not reverse the wider decline. By the late 13th century, the Mamluk Sultanate had become the dominant power in Egypt and Syria. Sultan Baybars and his successors systematically captured Crusader fortresses and cities. Antioch fell in 1268, Tripoli in 1289, and Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold, fell to Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil in 1291. The mainland Crusader states were finished, although crusading campaigns continued elsewhere, and proposals to recover Jerusalem persisted for centuries. The Crusades intensified hostility between Latin Christians, Orthodox Christians, Muslims, and Jews. They encouraged persecution, hardened religious identities, and left memories repeatedly reshaped for later political purposes. But they also took place in a Mediterranean, already connected by merchants, pilgrims, diplomats, and scholars. Even during war, people traded, negotiated, borrowed ideas, and formed alliances across religious boundaries. So, were the Crusades purely about faith? No. Were they secretly only about money? Also no. They were religious wars shaped by politics, personalities, economics, and local circumstances, and proof that history is rarely a simple battle between two neatly labeled teams. If you enjoyed this journey through history, like, share, and subscribe to Passport Studios for more animated stories from the past.